As all 50 states begin the process of reopening, workers have started trickling back to jobs shuttered during quarantine. But they're returning to jobs with fewer hours, lower wages, and safety requirements.
Service industry workers, in particular, who rely on tips, have seen a sharp decline in their wages with a limited number of patrons frequenting places like restaurants and bars. Joel Kotkin is Chapman University's Urban Futures Fellow and the author of The Coming of Neo-Feudalism, and he joins us now via Skype with his perspective on all of this. Great to see you.
Good to see you, Joel.
Nice to see you.
Talk to us about which communities have been hardest hit and which are going to have the most trouble recovering here.
Well, I think you can start off with, and of course this is made worse by the recent disorders in the cities, will be the inner city communities. They were hit hardest by COVID. They have a lot of small businesses. I've been interviewing small business people in, for instance, South LA, Santa Ana, and what you're really seeing, and I think it's really tragic, is that these small businesses that were deemed not essential are, many of them are never going to reopen. Obviously, where the looters have trashed things have made it even worse. So I think the inner city is in for a really rough turn, and I think that although obviously there were horrendous examples of police brutality, the economic impact of, let's say, defunding police, reducing police protection, that has never worked very well for the inner city. So I think those areas are going to be very hard hit. I think some of the areas that are rail dependent, I think some of them are going to have some rough times ahead, like the New York suburbs, but I think they'll reinvent themselves over time. And obviously there are certain industries that are hurt, and these are hospitality, hotels. Those, I mean, they're practically giving away hotel rooms now. And I also think that one of the big issues is going to be that many of the people who work in hospitality are minority and young people. The young people are really getting screwed in this situation because they got through the terrible recession of 2007, 2008. They were just coming back, and then they get hit again. And again, generally speaking, younger workers are paid less. They're in more precarious positions. And in many cases, they're the most likely to lose their jobs.
Yeah. Joel, can you talk about the social impact of something like this? What do we see in other countries or historically whenever you have, very large youth unemployment? And what you're talking about here is also lack of opportunity in the inner city, disproportionately affecting people who are minority communities. And then you also have, one of the things we haven't talked about here is that, the NASDAQ is at 10,000 for the very first time in a composite. We see much of the concentrated capital in America seems to be doing just fine. What is this all a recipe for over the next 10 years?
Well, let's just say it's not the recipe for stability. Fundamentally, you start off here. You start off with the idea not only that you have this large group of people who are in the inner city or struggling immigrants, but you also have this huge population of young people who have, in many cases, have been to school and yet are barely making it. Historically, this has been the class that has led to, on the extreme ends, things like what happened in Italy and France during the 1960s and 70s, and has happened repeatedly in South America. Large populations of educated, underemployed people are very, very dangerous to the social order. At the same time, you have the phenomena of a small group of companies and people becoming phenomenally richer. Jeff Bezos, for instance, is having a very good crisis. I think that Apple and Microsoft, all these companies have positioned themselves in a great way as we've been forced to rely more and more on digital technology. And I think that will continue. So you have this terrible problem now where wealth is becoming ever more concentrated, not just by income, but also by who has power, who doesn't have power, who controls the media, who doesn't control the media. And you're going to have a real issue with people who feel that some people have gotten very rich in the midst of this crisis, and most people have lost out. So the inequality issue, which really was very critical to both Bernie Sanders' campaign and the 2016 Trump campaign, that issue is going to be even bigger in the future.
Yeah, well, and as you point out, it is a vicious cycle because it's not just about wealth. It's also about power. It's also about who has sway and influence in this town.
Right.
And the wealthier, disproportionately, that this small group becomes, the more organized, the more influential, the more that they get to write the rules to continue to benefit themselves, which is how we end up with this situation where it's like they do well and profit off of whatever the situation. If it's a pandemic, they do great. If it's not a pandemic, they do great. I mean, it just doesn't matter what happens. It's heads they win and tails we lose.
Well, and also I think the other thing is that they are able, I don't think this is conscious, but I think things like, let's say, Black Lives Matter, fundamentally is raising some very important issues. But in the same time, Jeff Bezos can say, "Hey, we support Black Lives Matter." Do you support the redistribution of income? Do you support breaking up companies like Amazon, which make it impossible for smaller companies to exist? I mean,
right.
If you go into the inner city and even into the suburban shopping areas, think of all these companies that have generally lost customers and may have lost them permanently. And then you also have Wall Street, which is going to come in, buy the properties in the city that have declined, and try to take advantage of that situation. I mean, it's really it's really a tinderbox, and of obviously having the sort of mediocre to poor political leadership we have is just going to make it worse.
Yeah. And Joel, really, what do we know about which areas, which sectors, which people are going to face sort of permanent job loss that is unlikely to recover after the coronavirus crisis?
Well, it's a very good question. I would say one of the things would be restaurants, bars. I think you've mentioned that earlier. This group, which were, the people who, first of all, own those businesses, they are what in neo-feudalism I call the yeoman, the small business person. Very often the bulwark of a community, including the inner city community.
Sure.
They are going to be, really, really weakened over time. And I don't see where many of them are going to come back. That little taqueria that exists in Santa Ana or in East LA that has now been closed for 6 months or 3 months and was always struggling to start with. I think a lot of those will never open. I think it's going to be a long time before we get back into the convention business. I think hotels are going to be hurt for a long time. And what may happen is we may see a recovery in what we might call staycations, where you can drive somewhere. Mm-hmm. But the big international destinations, I think, are going to be hurting for a long time.
Yeah, and that has a lot of impact on a lot of very vulnerable people. Joel, thank you so much for joining us again. We really appreciate your insight.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Absolutely. Next on Rising, how will the Trump campaign reverse the president's polling decline? We're going to talk to Women for Trump's co-chair Pam Bondi when Rising continues.